The text arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, and it read, "They're ashamed you're their father." 7 words. Punctuation at the end. The kind of message that is designed to land like a verdict rather than a conversation, because conversations can be responded to, and verdicts are supposed to be final. Karen sent it at 7:14 a.m., which I know because I still have it. I have not deleted it. I keep it the way you keep certain things, not because they make you feel good, but because they tell you something true about what you are dealing with. And truth, even the ugly variety, is more useful than comfortable ignorance. My name is Jeffrey Smith. I am 44 years old. I live in the Westover Hills neighborhood of Fort Worth, Texas, in a house on Waits Avenue that I bought 3 years ago when I finally had enough distance from the divorce to think clearly about what kind of life I was going to build on the other side of it. I am a structural engineer. I have spent 18 years designing things that are supposed to hold under pressure, which is, as it turns out, a professional specialty that also applies to the interior life. I need to tell you about the divorce first, because the divorce is the foundation of everything that came after. Karen and I met in 2006 at the University of Texas in Arlington, where we were both studying engineering. Her civil, me structural. We married in 2009. The twins were born in 2013. Caleb and Connor, identical in appearance, entirely different in temperament from the first weeks of their lives. Caleb was the one who studied everything carefully before committing. Connor was the one who had already decided and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. I loved both of them with the specific disorienting intensity that parenthood produces in people who were not fully prepared for how completely it reorganizes your priorities. Every father says this. I am saying it again because it is true and because it matters to this story. The marriage started failing in 2015, which I know in retrospect was 2 years before I was willing to admit it. Karen had a pattern I had not fully understood when we were dating. A pattern of constructing narratives about people and then defending those narratives against evidence. The way some people defend a position in an argument not because they believe it, but because changing position feels like losing. When the narrative was about someone else, it was tolerable. When the narrative became about me, it was not. The point is that by 2017, the marriage was effectively over, and by early 2018, Karen had begun the process of building the post-marriage story. The one she would tell the boys. The one she would tell her family. The one she would tell anyone who asked. In that story, I was absent, emotionally unavailable. A man whose career mattered more than his children. A father the boys were better off without. The custody hearing was in September 2018. Karen had a better lawyer than me. She had also had 6 more months to prepare her narrative, and she had prepared it thoroughly. Friends who testified to my emotional distance. A therapist who had seen the boys twice and offered observations about their stress responses in the context of our household. Documentation of the hours I spent at work during a particularly demanding project in 2016 that had required extended presence at a job site in Dallas. I sat in that courtroom and listened to a version of myself that I did not recognize, presented by people who had decided the version was true and were delivering it with conviction. I did not fight hard enough. I want to be honest about that. Not because the case was hopeless. It was not hopeless. And a different attorney, more aggressively engaged, might have produced a different result. I did not fight hard enough because I had made a calculation that I believed at the time was correct, that contesting the custody aggressively would damage my relationship with the boys more than losing the case would, that the fight itself would become the story Karen told them about me. If I fight, she tells them I tried to take them away from her, I had thought. If I don't fight, she tells them I didn't care enough to try. Either way, she told the story. I understood that. I made the wrong calculation about which story did less damage. Karen got primary custody. I got every other weekend and Wednesday evenings, which is the arrangement that sounds reasonable in a courtroom and feels, in practice, like being a visitor in your children's lives. The text arrived 8 months later. March 2019. They're ashamed you're their father. My sons were 6 years old. I spent 2 years trying to be present within the constraints of what the custody arrangement allowed, and 2 years watching the constraints tighten. Karen moved from the house we had shared in Keller to an apartment in Southlake, still in the Fort Worth metro, technically within the boundaries the custody agreement established, but 12 miles further from my house in Westover Hills. She enrolled the boys in a new school. She introduced them to her new partner, a man named Larry, who appeared to be a perfectly decent person being used as a prop in a narrative about how complete her life was without me. The Wednesday evening visits became difficult in the specific way that everything becomes difficult when one parent is consistently undermining them. The boys were quiet in ways they had not been quiet before. They answered questions with single words. They looked at me the way children look at someone they have been told to be cautious around, and it is one of the specific, precise cruelties of parental alienation that you can see it happening in real time, and you cannot fix it without making it worse. Don't push, I told myself, every Wednesday. Just be here. Just be present. Be the version of yourself that is real, and trust that eventually they will be able to see it. I don't know if that was wisdom or resignation. Probably both. In 2020, I hired an attorney named Michelle, a family law specialist in Fort Worth who had been recommended by a colleague and who had the quality I most needed in that moment, which was honesty about what was realistically achievable and what was not. Michelle reviewed the case and told me that modifying the custody arrangement would require demonstrating a material change in circumstances, and that the standard for that was high. Keep documenting, she told me. Keep showing up. Keep being the parent you are. She looked at her files. And wait. I waited. The diagnosis came in the fall of 2021. Caleb, careful, deliberate Caleb, who had been studying everything before committing since he was 3 weeks old, was 8 years old when Karen called me. And it was the first time in 2 years that she had called me rather than texted, which told me before she said a word that the thing she was about to say was too large for a text message. Caleb is sick, she said. They think it's leukemia. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store on Camp Bowie Boulevard when she said it, and I stayed in that car for 11 minutes after the call ended. And I will not describe in detail what those 11 minutes were like because some things are private in a way that has nothing to do with the story you are trying to tell. What I will tell you is that when I walked back into the store to finish the shopping I had abandoned, I was already thinking about what I could do. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. ALL. I had spent the 11 minutes in the car on my phone reading everything I could absorb quickly about it, because reading is what I do when I am managing something large, and I need something to do with my hands and my brain. The survival rates for childhood ALL had improved dramatically in recent decades. The treatment was aggressive but manageable in many cases. The most significant variable in severe cases was bone marrow transplant, and the most significant variable in bone marrow transplant was finding a compatible donor. I did not wait to be asked. I called the oncology team at Cook Children's Medical Center in Fort Worth on a Monday morning and volunteered myself for HLA typing, the compatibility testing that determines whether a potential donor's immune cells match a recipient's closely enough for transplant. The nurse on the phone told me they had already begun the process of identifying potential donors, and that biological family members were typically tested first. I'm his father, I told her. A brief pause. We'll schedule you this week, she said. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these accounts had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The testing was done the following Thursday. I drove to Cook Children's on West Lancaster Avenue, gave blood, answered the intake questions, and drove back to Westover Hills. It was a routine process, quiet, medical, unremarkable in procedure if not in feeling. I did not hear from the oncology team for 4 days. On the 5th day, Dr. Sandra Rose called me. Dr. Rose was the lead oncologist on Caleb's case. I had met her briefly at a family conference Karen had reluctantly included me in, and she had struck me then as precisely the kind of doctor you want managing a serious diagnosis: thorough, direct, not given to false reassurance or unnecessary alarm. Her voice on the phone was careful in a way that was different from her usual careful. Mr. Smith, she said, I need to ask you a few questions before we discuss your test results. That is not how this call is supposed to start. I thought. Of course, I told her. How long have you been aware of your son's medical history? She asked. Since Caleb's diagnosis in October, I said. Karen called me when he was first diagnosed. And prior to that, have you been involved in their medical care? Vaccinations? Physicals? That kind of record? Karen has primary custody, I said. I have attended appointments when I was notified of them. That has not been consistently. A pause. Mr. Smith, Dr. Rose said, I would like you to come in, not for a follow-up test, to discuss the results of the test we have already run. Another pause. I have run it 3 times. I was in my home office, at my desk looking at a structural drawing I had been working on all morning. I set down my pen. When? I asked. Tomorrow morning, she said. If possible. I will be there, I told her. I did not know yet what she had found. I did not know that I was about to walk into a room where the story Karen had been telling for 6 years was going to come apart at the molecular level. I did not know that 5 words were going to change everything. What I knew was that a doctor who had run a test 3 times was asking me to come in. That was enough to know for the moment. Dr. Rose's office at Cook Children's is on the 4th floor of the main building on West Lancaster Avenue, with a window that faces west toward the Fort Worth skyline. I noticed the skyline when I sat down. The way you notice small specific things when you are managing a large amount of internal tension and your brain is looking for somewhere safe to rest. Dr. Rose sat across from me. She had the file. She had clearly been thinking about this conversation for at least 24 hours. Mr. Smith, she said, thank you for coming in. I want to start by telling you that this conversation is confidential, that I am bound by medical ethics, and that nothing I tell you today changes my commitment to Caleb's care. She folded her hands on the desk. I want you to hear that first. I understand, I said. HLA typing, the compatibility testing we ran, works by identifying specific genetic markers on white blood cells that determine immune compatibility for transplant purposes. She opened the file. When we run this test for a potential donor who is a biological parent, we expect to see specific patterns of shared markers between the parent and the child. The patterns are predictable and consistent. She looked at me. When we tested your sample against Caleb's, the patterns were consistent with biological paternity, she said. You are a strong potential match for Caleb. That is good news for his treatment options. Okay, I said. When we tested your sample against Connor's, she said the patterns were not consistent with biological paternity. She let that sit for a moment. We ran the test 3 times, Dr. Rose said. The result was the same each time. I consulted with our genetics team and with the hospital ethics board before calling you. She looked at me steadily. Mr. Smith, the genetic evidence indicates that you are not Connor's biological father. I looked at her. How is that possible? I said. They are twins. Dr. Rose folded her hands carefully. Caleb and Connor are fraternal twins, she said. Not identical. Fraternal twins develop from 2 separate eggs released during the same ovulation cycle. In rare cases, documented cases though uncommon, those 2 eggs can be fertilized by sperm from 2 different men if the mother had relations with more than one partner within the same fertile window. She said it the way physicians say difficult things, factually, without editorial weight, as though the information itself is neutral and only the circumstances give it gravity. It has a name, she said. Heteropaternal superfecundation. It is estimated to occur in approximately 1 in 13,000 fraternal twin pregnancies. It is rare. It is not impossible. I sat with that. So Karen, I said slowly. The genetic evidence indicates that during the conception window for the twins, Miss Harmon had contact with at least one other man, Dr. Rose said. I cannot tell you who that man is. I can only tell you what the genetics show. I thought about 2012, the year before the twins were born. The engineering conference Karen had attended in Houston in February, the 3 days I could not reach her, that she had explained as poor cell service at the hotel. I had believed her. I had driven 40 minutes to pick her up from DFW when she flew back. I had carried her bag to the car. I had believed her for 9 years. Are you all right? Dr. Rose asked. Yes, I told her. I meant it, which surprised me. I am. Yes. Can I ask you something? Of course. Does Karen know? I asked. We have not yet contacted Ms. Harmon with this information, she said. We wanted to speak with you first given that you are the one who was tested, and given the complexity of what the results suggest. She knows, I said. Dr. Rose looked at me. I am not speculating, I told her. I am telling you. She knows. She has always known. I looked at the file on her desk. The question is, who else does? There is a specific quality to certain moments, the ones where something you have been carrying without knowing you were carrying it suddenly has a name. I had not known I was carrying a question about Connor. I had not known there was a question to carry. But sitting in that office on a Wednesday morning, something in me recognized those words the way you recognize a sound you have heard before but could not previously identify. Connor's eyes, I thought. Connor's eyes are brown. Karen's eyes are green. Mine are gray. I had thought about Connor's eyes exactly once, briefly, in 2014, and I had dismissed the thought the way you dismiss things you are not ready to examine. I had dismissed it for 7 years. I was not dismissing it anymore. I left Dr. Rose's office at 10:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. I drove directly from Cook Children's to Michelle's office on West 7th Street in the Cultural District. Michelle was with a client. I told her paralegal it was urgent. Michelle came out 12 minutes later, took one look at my face, and said, "Come in." I told her everything. The test, the results, Dr. Rose's conversation, the Houston conference. All of it. Michelle is not a person who expresses shock easily. She has been practicing family law in Fort Worth for 20 years and has heard most of the things that human beings do to each other in the context of marriage and divorce. She listened to me with her legal pad in front of her and her pen moving, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The original custody proceedings," she said. "Did Karen make any representations to the court about the twins' parentage? Any documentation, any testimony, anything that would constitute a sworn statement that both boys were your biological children?" "The custody filing lists me as the father of both boys," I said. "The birth certificates list me as the father of both boys." Karen signed both documents. Michelle wrote something. "If Connor is not your biological child," she said carefully, and Karen knew that at the time of the custody proceedings, then those representations were material misrepresentations made under oath to a family court. She looked at me. "That is fraud on the court, Jeffrey. That is not a small thing." "I know," I said. "Does Connor's biological father know about him?" Michelle asked. I looked at her. "I do not know. That is a question only Karen can answer. And right now, Karen is not answering anything." Michelle wrote something else on her legal pad. "That becomes relevant to any adoption petition," she said. "A biological father has legal rights that would need to be addressed before an adoption can be finalized. We will need to establish whether he is known, whether he has ever been involved, and whether he intends to assert any claim." She looked at me. "Do you want to pursue this regardless of what we find?" I thought about Connor in a hospital waiting room. Somewhere in the future, a boy who was my son in every way that mattered. In every way I had been capable of demonstrating through 3 years of Wednesday evenings and every other weekends in a text message that said his brother needed a donor and I had already raised my hand. "Connor is my son," I said. "Whatever it takes, yes." "I need to be very careful about how we proceed," Michelle said, "because there is a child involved here. Connor, who is 8 years old and who has no knowledge of any of this. Whatever we do, his welfare has to be the primary consideration." "I know that too," I said. Michelle looked at her legal pad for a moment. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not legally. What do you actually want?" I thought about that for a while before I answered. "I want to be in my son's lives," I said. "Both of them. Connor is my son. Biologically or not, he is my son. I have been his father since he was born. I want that recognized, and I want the lies that have been told about me to those boys to stop." I looked at Michelle. "That is what I want." Michelle nodded slowly. "Then here is what we are going to do," she said. The plan had 2 tracks running simultaneously. Track 1, Michelle filed a motion to reopen the custody proceedings on grounds of fraud. Specifically, Karen's material misrepresentation of Connor's paternity in the original filing. This was not a punitive move, it was a necessary legal step to address a foundation that had been built on false information. Track 2. I reached out to Dr. Rose and asked whether, given the medical circumstances, it would be possible for the medical team to be present when Karen was informed of Connor's test results. Dr. Rose consulted with the ethics board again. The board determined that the information needed to be disclosed to Karen, and that given the legal and emotional complexity of the situation, having my attorney present, and having me present as the person most directly affected, was appropriate. Karen was called in for a meeting at Cook Children's on a Friday morning. She did not know I would be there. She had been told it was a follow-up regarding the donor testing process. I arrived 15 minutes early. I sat in Dr. Rose's office and I looked at the Fort Worth skyline, and I thought about 7 years of Wednesday evenings and every other weekends, and a text message that said they're ashamed you're their father. And I thought about Caleb's careful, deliberate eyes and Connor's quick, decided ones. And I thought about what it means to be a father. Not as a biological fact, but as a sustained act of presence and choice. Whatever happens in this room, I thought, Connor is my son. That does not change. I will not let it change. Karen arrived at 9:03 a.m. She walked into the office and saw me and stopped. "What is he doing here?" she said. Dr. Rose gestured to the chair. "Please sit down, Miss Harmon," she said. "There are some test results I need to discuss with you. If you have been listening to this and you are not subscribed yet, do it right now. Because what happens in this room, and what Karen's face does when 5 words land in it, is something you are going to want to hear. Subscribe." Karen sat. She sat the way a person sits when they are in a room they have decided to control. Straight, hands in her lap, eyes on Dr. Rose rather than on me. Dr. Rose explained the HLA typing process. She explained the results. She explained that she had run the test 3 times. She explained, in the measured and precise language of a physician who has delivered difficult information many times, the results for both boys, the confirmation that Jeffrey was Caleb's biological father, and then the finding, delivered without drama, without pause, without any additional weight beyond the words themselves, that the genetic evidence indicated Jeffrey Smith was not Connor's biological father. She explained heteropaternal superfecundation, the 1 in 13,000 statistic, the science behind it, what it meant. Karen's face did not collapse. She is not a person who collapses. What happened to her face was something more controlled and more revealing, the specific expression of a person who has been managing a secret for a long time and has just watched the last piece of infrastructure holding it in place give way. The expression of someone who had run a calculation for 9 years and had just been told the calculation was visible. She looked at the desk. She looked at her hands. She did not look at me. "Miss Harmon," Dr. Rose said, "is there anything you would like to say?" A long silence. "I would like to speak with my attorney," Karen said. "Of course," Dr. Rose said. Karen stood. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the door. She stopped. She turned and looked at me for the first time since she had walked in. I looked back at her. I did not say anything. I did not need to say anything. Everything that needed to be said had already been said by a genetics test run 3 times on a Wednesday morning by a doctor who had not expected to find what she found. Karen left. I stayed in the chair by the window for a few more minutes looking at the Fort Worth skyline. Some things you cannot unfind, I thought. Some truths wait patiently for the moment they become impossible to hide. This had been hers. The custody modification hearing was in February. Not February of the following year. The same year, 4 months after the meeting in Dr. Rose's office, because Michelle had filed immediately in the nature of the grounds, fraud on the court, had produced a level of judicial attention that moved the case forward faster than family court proceedings typically move. I want to tell you what happened in that hearing, but I want to tell you something else first, because the hearing is the legal story, and the legal story, while important, is not the whole story. In December, 6 weeks after the meeting at Cook Children's, Caleb began the bone marrow transplant process. I was the donor. The procedure was at Cook Children's, and it went as well as these procedures go. Which is to say, it was difficult and exhausting and frightening in the specific way that medical procedures involving your child are frightening. And it was also the most important thing I have done with my body in 44 years of using it. I sat with Caleb in the recovery room afterward. Karen was there too, in the chair on the other side of the bed. We did not speak to each other. We did not need to. There are rooms where the ordinary architecture of a relationship, the conflict, the history, the grievances, becomes irrelevant, and a hospital recovery room after a bone marrow transplant is one of them. Caleb was 8 years old, and he was going to be all right, and that was the only thing that mattered in that room. Connor was in the waiting room when I came out. He was sitting with Karen's mother, a woman named Diane who had always been civil to me, even through the divorce, and who looked at me with the specific expression of a woman who has been told things about a person for years and is currently revising her assessment. Connor looked up when I came through the door. He had Karen's coloring, darker than Caleb, darker than me. He had the quick, decided energy I had known since he was 3 weeks old. He was 8 years old and he had been told things about me for 3 years, and he was sitting in a hospital waiting room because his brother was sick, and he was afraid. "Is Caleb okay?" he asked. "He is okay," I told him. "He is resting. You can see him in a little while." Connor looked at me for a moment with the assessing attention I had always associated with him. "You gave him your bone marrow," he said. "Yes," I said. "Does it hurt?" "A little," I told him. "Not much." Connor looked at his shoes. "Mom said you don't care about us," he said. Not accusatory, informational. The way 8-year-olds deliver things they have been told that they are not sure they believe. I sat down in the chair beside him. "I know she did," I told him. "What do you think?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I think you gave Caleb your bone marrow," he said. "Yes," I thought. "Exactly." "Connor," I said, "there are going to be some things that change over the next few months, some things you will hear that might be confusing. And I want you to know, whatever you hear, whatever changes, you are my son. That is not something that changes. Do you understand?" He looked at me. "Even if I'm not," he started, and then stopped, which told me that someone had already said something to him, or that he had overheard something, or that 8-year-olds are more perceptive than adults generally credit. "Even if anything," I said, "you are my son. Full stop." Connor was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned against my arm, which is the thing children do when they have decided to trust you and do not have words for it yet. I put my arm around him, and we sat in the waiting room together until the nurse came to tell us Caleb was ready for visitors. The process of locating Connor's biological father took 6 weeks. Michelle handled it. I did not ask for details beyond what was legally necessary. What I know is this: he was located, he was informed, he had known, or suspected, for years. He had made a decision long before this moment not to be involved, and when the relinquishment of parental rights was placed in front of him, he signed it without contesting. Michelle told me he was aware. He had always been aware. He chose not to be involved when it could have mattered. I felt something closer to relief. That Connor had not spent 8 years wondering about a man who wanted him, only to discover the man had simply chosen absence. The absence was familiar territory. I knew how to fill it. I had been filling it for 8 years. The February hearing. Karen's attorney had the unenviable task of arguing against a medical record and a fraud on the court finding, which is roughly equivalent to arguing against gravity. He did his job. He raised procedural objections. He argued about the standard of evidence. He made the points that were available to be made, but the points available to be made were limited, because the central fact was not in dispute. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Kwan, who had been on the family court bench in Tarrant County for 14 years, reviewed the documentation with the careful attention of someone who has seen a great deal of human behavior and maintains a studied neutrality about most of it. But when she set down the file and looked at Karen across the courtroom, there was something in her expression that was not quite neutral. "The court finds that material misrepresentations were made in the original custody proceedings," Judge Kwan said. "Specifically, the representation that Jeffrey Smith was the biological father of both minor children when the petitioner had reason to know or knew that this was not accurate with respect to the minor child Connor." Karen was very still. "The custody arrangement is hereby modified to shared custody, with the minor children spending equal time with each parent." Judge Kwan looked at the file again. "The court also notes for the record that Mr. Smith has expressed his intention to formally adopt the minor child Connor, and that this court will look favorably upon that petition when it is filed." I looked at my hands. Caleb and Connor. My sons. Both of them. The formal adoption of Connor was completed in April. Judge Kwan signed the order on a Thursday afternoon. Michelle called me from the courthouse. It is done, she said. Thank you, I told her. Jeffrey. Her voice had a quality it does not usually have. You did this right. I want you to know that. The way you handled this, the patience, the decision to make Connor the priority, the decision not to make this uglier than it had to be, that is not nothing. I did not know what to say to that. He is my son, I said. That is all it is. Here is the complication I had not fully prepared for, because complications in stories like this are never the ones you expect. 3 weeks after the February hearing, Caleb asked me a question. We were at my house in Westover Hills. It was a Wednesday evening, the first Wednesday of the new custody schedule. The first time the boys had come to my house not as every other weekend visitors, but as children who lived here part of the time, with drawers of their own and space on the bookshelf, and a specific quality of presence that felt different from visiting. We had eaten dinner. Connor was in the other room with a video game. Caleb was at the kitchen table with me, working on a math assignment, and he was doing the thing he does when he is building toward a question. Going quiet, working methodically, waiting for the right moment. Dad, he said. Yeah. Why didn't Mom tell us the truth? About Connor? The kitchen was quiet. The sound of Connor's video game came faintly from the living room. I thought about this carefully. Not about what was strategic to say, or what protected me, or what was calibrated to produce a specific effect in an 8-year-old's understanding. I thought about what was true and what Caleb could carry at 8 years old, and what his relationship with his mother needed to survive this, because it did need to survive it. Karen was still his mother, whatever she had done, and Caleb was going to need that relationship for the rest of his life. I think, I said slowly, that she made a decision a long time ago that she thought was protecting you, and that she kept making it because stopping felt harder than continuing. I looked at him. That does not make it right, but it is what I think. Caleb considered this with the deliberate attention he gives to everything. Were you angry? He asked. Yes, I told him. For a while, are you still? I thought about that honestly. No, I said. I am not still angry. I got my sons back. Both of you. That is what I wanted. Caleb looked at his math assignment. She told us you did not care, he said. Not accusatory, just placing it on the table between us to be looked at honestly. I know, I said. And I think there is a part of her that believed it, because it was easier than the alternative. I looked at him. Caleb, the thing I want you to hold on to is this. I was always here, every Wednesday, every other weekend. Every time I was allowed to be there, I was there. The caring was never the question. He looked at me for a long moment. I know, he said. I think I always knew. He went back to his math assignment. Connor's video game made a triumphant sound from the living room. That, I thought, is everything. Caleb's treatment continued through the spring. By summer, the oncology team was using the word they use carefully but mean completely. Remission. Dr. Rose called me with the update on a Tuesday morning, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store on Camp Bowie Boulevard, the same parking lot where I had received the diagnosis call 14 months earlier. And I stayed there for a while, not managing anything, just sitting with the specific relief of a thing that went right when it could have gone wrong. If you have made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people listen without ever doing it. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. Now, the last thing I want to tell you. Here is the thing I have been thinking about since the Wednesday evening when Caleb sat at my kitchen table and asked why his mother had not told the truth. The answer I gave him was incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. Because the full answer is more complicated than the version I could give an 8-year-old, and I want to give you the full version, because you are adults and because this story is not just about what happened to me. Karen built a narrative. She built it carefully, over years, with the specific skill of someone who understands that the story told first tends to be the story believed. She told her attorney, she told her friends, she told the family court, and most damagingly, she told my sons. And she told them at an age when they were too young to evaluate the story against their own experience, and had to take it on faith. That is what parental alienation is. It is not always dramatic. It is not always abusive in the obvious sense. Sometimes it is simply a sustained campaign of narrative, the slow, consistent replacement of a person's actual presence and character with a story about them that serves the teller's interests. And it is effective precisely because children trust the parent who is telling it. What stopped Karen's narrative was not confrontation. It was not argument. It was not me providing a counter-narrative. It was a genetic test run 3 times by a doctor who was not looking for a secret and found one anyway. The truth does not need to be argued. It only needs to survive long enough to be found. I want to say something about Connor, because Connor is the person in this story who was most wronged by a situation he had no part in creating. Connor did not choose his biology. He did not choose the secret his mother kept. He did not choose to be the child whose existence contained an inconvenient truth that shaped the entire architecture of his family's life. He was 3 years old when the divorce happened, and 8 years old when the truth was exposed, and everything in between was managed around him without his knowledge by adults who were supposed to protect him. When I sat down beside him in that waiting room and said, "You are my son," full stop, I meant it in the full weight of what that means. Not as a legal statement, not as a strategic claim, not as something I was saying to make a point. I meant it the way I have always meant it. From the first weeks of his life, when he would look at everything with those quick, decided eyes, and I would think, this one already knows what he wants. He is my son. The adoption made it legal. The preceding 8 years made it true. The educational layer of this story, and there is one, underneath everything, is about documentation and patience and the specific courage required not to fight when fighting would make things worse. I made a mistake in the original custody proceedings. I did not fight hard enough because I was afraid of what the fight would cost. That was a real mistake with real consequences. And I am not going to reframe it as wisdom. It was a calculation, and the calculation was wrong, and I lived with the consequences of it for 3 years. What I did right was stay present, show up for the Wednesdays and the every other weekends. Not argue, not campaign, not counter-narrative. Just be there consistently in the way that presence accumulates into something children can eventually see. And when the moment came, when Caleb needed a donor and I raised my hand without being asked, I did it because it was the right thing to do, not because I was thinking about what it would reveal. The revelation was a consequence, not a plan. I was not strategic. I was just his father. That distinction matters. The people who plan their revenge rarely get it as cleanly as the people who simply go on living their lives with integrity and let the truth do its own work. Karen's secret was always going to find a moment like that one, a medical emergency, a legal proceeding, a simple question, something the truth does not require a plan, it requires patience and a door left open. The door was a blood test. The truth walked through it. Karen built a story in which I was absent and ashamed and unworthy of my own sons. She sent me a text message at 7:14 in the morning, designed to make that story feel final. She used a family court and 6 years of carefully managed access and the trust of 2 small boys to maintain it. What she did not account for, what people who build those stories never fully account for, is that the man who shows up every Wednesday, who drives every other weekend, who raises his hand when his son needs a donor without waiting to be asked, is not the man she described. And children, given enough time and enough Wednesdays, eventually figure out the difference between the story they were told and the person who is actually standing in front of them. Caleb figured it out at the kitchen table, doing his math homework. Connor figured it out in a hospital waiting room, watching a man with a sore arm walk through the door. "I think you gave Caleb your bone marrow," Connor said. "Yes, that is all it was. That is the whole story. My sons are home, both of them. That is enough." If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.